Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Goodman, Director of Social Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. I first want to thank Professor Maya Rossin-Slater of Stanford University here with us today to discuss a recent paper, The Impact of Paid Family Leave on Employers, Evidence from New York, which she co-authored with several others. Maya is an associate professor at the Center for Health Policy in the Department of Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine, and she's an expert on paid leave, and I'm so grateful to her for making the time to discuss her latest work with us. Just to give a little, yeah, of course. And just to give a little bit of background, the US is the only high-income country that does not guarantee paid leave on the federal level. And only 8 states and DC have implemented or passed paid family leave legislation. Much of the literature around paid leave describes the benefits, of which there are innumerable ones for families and children and those in a caregiving role. But I really thought this paper stands out because it looks at paid leave from a different angle, that is the experience of employers and the potential costs and burdens that they incur. So I'm excited to discuss this paper with you today.
Great, thank you.
So if you could just get started, you could briefly introduce yourself, describe the paper a little bit, and your motivation for studying this topic in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, my name is Maya Rossin-Slater. I'm an associate professor at the Stanford School of Medicine in health policy, and I'm also affiliated with the Stanford Institute for Economic and Policy Research, SIEPR. This study is joint with professors Ann Bartel, Christopher Ruhm, Jane Waldfogel, and PhD student Meredith Slopen, who's at the Columbia School of Social Work. And we set out to do our research because, as you said, over the last, several decades by now, there's been an abundance of evidence coming out of studies, both from the United States and from other countries, showing the multitude of benefits of paid family leave policies for both workers as well as their families. So in terms of things like infant health, maternal health and well-being, some mixed evidence on women's labor market trajectories, but for the most part, fairly positive or non-effects. So the benefits to families from these policies are clear, but I would say, the biggest roadblock to passing paid leave legislation in the United States has been this concern about the potential costs of these policies, specifically the costs to employers. And so some of the strongest opponents of federal paid leave legislation have been organizations that represent interests of businesses and especially small businesses. And the biggest concern is that implementing a government level paid leave policy is going to be an excessive burden for businesses. So even if they don't actually have to pay for the leave themselves, basically almost all current state level paid leave policies are financed through employee payroll taxes. I believe most federal proposals have similar financing mechanisms. So employers actually don't have to pay for the leave themselves. But of course, they might incur other costs when they have to navigate having their employees take leave for several weeks at a time. And this might be particularly burdensome for small businesses, that just have a few workers. And so, dealing with one worker's absence could be particularly challenging. But to date, there's been very limited evidence on this question. So largely due to data constraints. So we just haven't really known what happens to employers after paid leave policies are implemented. And the current evidence really comes mostly from California, where there's, Eileen Applebaum and Ruth Milkman have done survey work with businesses in California to ask them about their experiences with paid leave. But one challenge with that is that those surveys already took place after California had implemented their paid leave policy. So we haven't been able to assess what happens from before to after. So this is where our study comes in, which is, we had found out that New York was implementing their state level paid leave policy. And we were fortunate enough to know this information in advance of when it actually went into effect. So New York's policy went into effect in 2018. New York was the 4th state to implement a paid family leave policy. And we went in and we surveyed employers, small and medium-sized employers with fewer than 100 workers in New York in the 2 years before their policy went into effect. So we were there in 2016 and 2017. And then we followed these businesses afterwards in 2018 and 2019. And actually, we have an ongoing survey now trying to understand what happened during COVID. And then for a comparison group, we also surveyed similar employers in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is, of course, a nearby state, but has not had a paid leave policy yet. And so we asked them questions on a range of issues, but we were mostly interested in exactly this question of how do businesses deal with situations when their workers need to take leave. And so we, for example, asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how easy is it for them to deal with employee absences of different durations, less than 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, or 4 weeks or more. And then we analyzed, what was the change in New York in this outcome relative to the same change over the same time period in Pennsylvania, which again was our control state that did not have a paid leave policy. We also looked at outcomes related to how employers view, their workers' productivity, their attachment to the job, their cooperation, things like that. And then we also collected information on the composition of the workforce, so the share of employees who are female, the share of employees who work part-time, the share of employees who are absent without notice, and the share of employees who quit. And so we looked at all of these outcomes. And what we found was that after New York's policy went into effect, employers in New York actually found it easier to deal with employee absences that are longer than 2 weeks in duration. So this effect was materialized primarily in the first year after the policy was implemented. So it was relatively short-lived in the sense that there was a bump up in the ease of dealing with these absences, and then it sort of went back to the baseline level, but it did not go down, like it did not get harder to deal with these absences. And then the other thing is that employee leave taking also went up substantially, and this effect was concentrated amongst the smallest employers in our sample, those with fewer than 50 employees. And this makes sense because those are the employers that were not eligible for the federal Family Medical Leave Act, which provides unpaid job protected leave, and that has been in existence for a number of years now. So these employers, the workers of these employers, had their first experience with having access to job protected, and in this case, paid leave. So we actually see them taking it up and using it. And then the other two sets of findings that I'd like to mention here is that we found no adverse impacts on any of the employer ratings of worker productivity and attachment to the job. I should say those ratings were quite high already before the policy went into effect, but they did not change basically after the policy was implemented. And then we also asked New York employers to rate, just their views about the policy, basically on a scale of 1 to 5, how favorable or opposed, how much do you favor versus oppose the New York paid family leave law? And we found that the majority of employers in New York are supportive of the policy, both before it went into effect, as well as in the 2 years after it went into effect. So we think that that's reassuring, and that suggests that employers, seem to like this policy for the most part. There is a small share of employers who are opposed, and that share has grown over time. That remains to be, that should be the subject of follow-up research. We really would like to understand what's going on with the employers who are opposed and why are they opposed. We did collect some kind of qualitative information from employers. Basically, we gave them the opportunity to provide any feedback or comments as part of our survey. And one of the things that came out of that was it seemed like there was some kind of confusion about how to navigate this new policy, especially among some of the smaller employers in our study that maybe don't have kind of big HR units or teams. So, we think that hopefully as the policy becomes more commonplace and more standard, maybe some of that opposition would fall. So I'll pause here and let you ask questions.
Sure. No, that's really wonderful. Thank you. Do you expect to keep this survey going? You mentioned that you'll have results from the pandemic. What's sort of the lifespan, do you think, of it?
Yeah, so at the moment, I think we have funding for this year of the pandemic, because that was already in the field. I'm not sure if we'll be able to keep this specific survey going, in the follow-up years. That just has to do with how much funding we have. I mean, the other thing is, of course, because of the pandemic changed everything. And so it will be really hard to sort of separate out the effects of paid leave versus the pandemic and sort of think about that. We wanted to do the 2020 survey because we wanted to understand how employers in our survey navigated the pandemic, the ones at least that survived. And we also want to understand how many didn't survive as a result of the pandemic. And if we can learn something about whether New York's paid leave policy kind of affected their experience during the pandemic, that would be, I think, helpful information. But it is challenging in the research world, kind of navigating this fact that there's been this huge disruption due to COVID in 2020. So sort of attributing effects to New York's policy becomes much harder.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword where it's kind of a natural experiment that comes into play, but I'm sure it's disrupting things, as you're mentioning. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the effects on firms of different sizes. You mentioned leave taking increased in some of the smaller firms, and how that might have reflected across the results.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the pattern that we saw in our data was that the leave taking increase was concentrated amongst the smaller employers that were previously that are still ineligible for the FMLA, whereas the bump up in the ease of dealing with employee absences actually was concentrated amongst the firms that are kind of in the 50 to 99 worker range. So I think this kind of makes sense. Because if you think about it, for the smaller employers, even if it is getting easier to deal with worker absences, you now have more of them because more people are using leave because the policy exists. So it's kind of counteracts one another potentially. So I think, so it makes sense that kind of amongst the smaller employers, we don't actually see kind of an improvement in the ease of dealing with absences because you now just have more workers to navigate that. But again, I should really emphasize, we don't also see a deterioration. Like, I think the main concern amongst opponents of paid leave, that there's going to be a negative effect, that there's a cost to these businesses as a result of their being paid leave. And we find no evidence that there's a cost to these businesses, especially, at least, in these first 2 years, of course, but especially for the things that people are the most concerned about, which is in terms of things like, how do they deal with workers being gone?
Mm-hmm. So I guess just following up to that, we've been talking sort of about how employer costs and burdens are one of the biggest barriers to a federal paid leave program. Are there any other barriers that you think about or that are in the literature?
Yeah, I think the other concern that maybe is kind of related is that employers are going to discriminate against workers who are more likely to use leave, such as women of childbearing age, right? So sort of a related concern is that because these policies are burdensome for these employers are going to react in a way that could be systematically, discriminatory against certain groups. Such as women who are, much more likely to use leave than men. Although in our sample, I should say, when we see that increase in leave taking, we see it amongst both women and men. So I should note that that's kind of an important finding. But so there's this concern that this is going to lead to, fewer women being hired, or fewer women or more women leaving, and so on. We find no evidence of that either. So we looked at the composition of firms in our study, the share of women, for example, and the share part-time, the share of workers who quit. We find no change in these outcomes. At least in the first 2 years, we find no evidence of this sort of discrimination going on amongst the employers in our study.
That's great. And I'm glad to hear that it increased both male and female leave taking. I guess when we're thinking about some of these barriers, are there any lessons from abroad on implementation that you think can inform how we design the policy or think about these barriers?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the policies that exist outside of the United States, a lot of them are quite different than what is currently under discussion in the US. Most of them are much longer, right? So we're typically talking about policies that are maybe about a year in length, maybe even longer. A lot of them are also, so for example, in the Scandinavian countries, you have policies which are assigned jointly. So when it comes to parental leave, the policy is assigned jointly to both, biological parents of a child, or both parents of a child. And then they can decide, typically how they share that leave amongst themselves. And then you have these issues where women, have historically taken a lot more of the leave than men. And so to sort of try to mitigate that, these countries have passed these quotas for fathers to use, 1, 2, 3 months of leave, and so on. So there's these types of issues that have arose in other countries that I think are not as relevant to the US setting. And I think I actually would say, like, the US way of trying to give leave to people, I think makes sense. Because it's at the individual level. So it's not about, dealing with how to share it between, your partner and, and so on. For example, in California, under the paid family leave policy, both fathers and mothers can get, the same length of leave. Of course, mothers are also eligible, for example, for in some states for temporary disability insurance, which is specifically for birth mothers for the purposes of preparing for and recovering from childbirth. So that's a separate leave program. So in some cases, women do get more leave because of sort of the violence, sort of the physical aspect of giving birth. But by and large, the policies in the US, are implemented kind of at the individual level. The other thing that I think is also good about the US policies is that they provide leave not just for new parents, but also for other caregiving needs. That's important. That has not been as common of a feature in policies in other countries around the world. And I think, it's important for a couple of reasons. I think sort of politically, it's important because one of the concerns that people raise with parental leave only is that, well, what about workers that don't have kids? Like, why do they not get a policy? And, family leave acknowledges the fact that it's sort of an insurance program. Everyone might at some point have a need, a caregiving need, whether that's because of a new child or because of a family member that gets ill, or even for their own, injury or illness. And so it sort of makes it a much more inclusive policy for workers with all kinds of issues and needs. And so I think that as well, in my opinion, is a positive thing about the policies that are under discussion in the United States.
Great. And we talked a little bit about this before, but the Biden administration has promised that paid family leave will be a part of the next package, the American Family Plan, with more details expected as early as next week. Based on your research, what do you think should be top of mind when we're thinking about paid leave in that package, and any lessons learned from the pandemic, where we've obviously seen the conversations around leave change?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted is the inequity. I mean, we have known that there's a lot of inequality in this country, but the pandemic really, made that so clear. Inequity in terms of who has access to employer provided leave, inequity in who can actually use the policy, even if they have access to it, because oftentimes, pretty much all of the current state level policies don't provide 100% wage replacement. So some people can't afford to take leave if they don't get their full, wages during that time.
Right.
And all kinds of sort of other types of barriers, stigma related barriers, especially when it comes for men taking leave, and relative to women, people not knowing about the policy. These being, in California, I hear a lot about how complicated it is to just navigate the website that you need to access in order to claim your benefits. And so there's just all these things that it seems like are unnecessary burdens that people face and that disproportionately fall on lower wage workers, on workers of color, on families who kind of need these policies the most. So I think I'm super excited that there's discussions of potentially federal level policy. And I think, front and center amongst those discussions should be this consideration of how do we, when we pass these policies, how do we reduce the barriers to take up? Because currently there's too many barriers to take up, especially for the lowest income workers. And I think making sure that, sort of having a progressive wage replacement schedule where, the lowest wage workers do get maybe all of their earnings replaced, at least the majority of them, having a streamlined, easy process to actually access the benefits, having clear information. One of the things that we found in our study of California leave is that there's a lot of variation across firms in the share of workers who use California's leave policy. So this is not about firms having their own policies or not. This is about the state level policy. And there's substantial variation amongst workers at different types of firms in terms of what share of them actually use these policies. Now, we don't know exactly what's driving this variation. Unfortunately, we didn't have the data to look into that very precisely. But our guess is that a lot of it has to do with cultures at firms and the information provision. So a lot of times workers are only going to find out about these policies through their employer, or at least that's their first place where they would turn to go to find out about what they're eligible for. So making sure that there's sort of equal access to this information is important. And the harder thing to change, unfortunately, with policy can only do so much, is of course the internal culture at the firm, making it normal, making it sort of a standard thing that people can use leave, can take leave for all these different caregiving needs is so important for reducing barriers for workers to actually reap the benefits of these policies. We find that there's these benefits for workers and families, but you're only going to get those benefits if you actually know about the policy and use the policy. So I think it's great that there's potentially a lot more action to be happening on this front at the policy level. And I think a lot of attention has to be paid on making sure that that benefit, if and when it is here in the US, is as equitably distributed as possible.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. And I'm hopeful that as we've seen more leave taking and people parenting visibly in front of coworkers and organizations, that the narrative around that might change. I guess as sort of a final question, you've mentioned a few areas where you'd like to see more research. Are there any other topics where you would like to see research on leave, or what's next for you in this space?
Yeah, I think, our study was just, I think, hopefully the first of several on employers. I think we need to know a lot more. I mean, this seems to be like the central kind of issue that's out there that's relatively unknown. What's going on with employers when these policies are introduced? And so I hope to see more research, more longer term research on what's going on amongst employers. I also, I think a lot of the evidence on the benefits to kids, at least in the long term, comes from countries outside of the US. So I think that part of that is just the US hasn't had policies for long enough to be able to track people over a long time period. But as that changes, California's policy has now been in effect for 17 years.
Wow.
So, we now have longer and longer follow-up windows. So hopefully we can learn more about how these policies might not have just short-term impact on things like infant health, on things like maternal mental health, on breastfeeding, on immunizations, things like that, but could be also viewed as investments into the future. There's, I think, a lot of discussion about the value of early childhood investments. We typically think of that in the context of things like early education interventions, like preschool programs and things like that. Maybe family leave could be viewed as part of that discussion, but we need to have evidence on the extent to which there are any long-term impacts of these policies on people's longer-term outcomes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. This has been really interesting, and thanks for making the time to discuss this paper with me. I hope folks take the time to read the full paper, which will be linked to the recording for this conversation. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the momentum carries forward and leads us to a federal program and policy.
Yes, thank you so much again.